Thank you very much, Indy. Our respondent today is Dr. Ofri Ilany. He received his PhD at Tel Aviv University, which he wrote under the guidance of Professor Shulamit Volkov. He was a postdoc fellow at the Hebrew University and the Humboldt University, and now he is a Polonsky Fellow for Advanced Study in the Humanities, at the Humanities and Social Sciences, I guess, at the Van Leer Institute. And in 2016, his book, החיפוש אחר העם העברי, תנ"ך ונאורות בגרמניה, was published at the Leo Baeck Institute and Zalman Shazar. And if I may add, Ofri is also a public intellectual, which is really an endangered species in our culture. Ofri.
Thank you very much, Ishai, and thanks to Scott for inviting me, and thank you very much, Professor Nyman, for this extremely rich, enlightening, and thought-provoking talk. I'm a historian and not a Bible scholar, so I can hardly comment on the part of your presentation dealing with the complexities of philology and authorship, which is, of course, a major part of your presentation. But I did study the history of German Bible research, and I will make a few very general remarks about the question of supersessionism and the Philosemitism as manifested in the German test case, which is, of course, much more than a mere test case. I hope that it sheds light on certain characteristics of the treatment of the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew legacy, so to say, and Judaism. And I think those questions are also pretty relevant for scholars of anti-Semitism. Professor Nyman has convincingly argued that Protestant biblical theology was deeply supersessionist and historicist. But to start with, I'm not sure that this problem of adopting the Protestant worldview is specific to the case of Bible and Jewish studies. As we know very well, many modern concepts, including, for example, art, spirituality, and even love and history, are to a large extent Christian and many times Protestant. In his essay on the beginnings of modern Jewish studies, Nahum Glatzer pointed out that 19th and 20th century Jewish thinkers were forced to explain Judaism in terms of world history, and, I quote Glatzer, world history has had its own tradition, Christianity, which, reinterpreted, lived on in secular formulations. The Jew entered this domain without a tradition of his own. He was a homo novus, in search of a home in a world that was not yet ready to grant him this privilege. End of quote. However, the major challenge for Jewish scholars' inclusion in non-Jewish narratives of world history is the fact that Christian world history was indeed foreign, but far from unfamiliar. Jews were not forced to adopt a completely strange symbolic order, like many colonized groups, for example. Christian philosophy of history was never indifferent towards the Jews. They play a major part in Christian drama of world history, and this drama is supersessionist. Namely, yes, of course, ancient Israel is superseded by a new Israel, which is, the Christian church. There is no doubt that German Bible scholarship posited the Jewish interpretation of the Bible as a paradigm of the text obfuscation. The modern Protestant interpreter must free himself from the Jewish interpretations and its influences if he is to arrive at an authentic understanding of the text. Moreover, Professor Nyman argues that even philosemitic Bible research, so to say, was not about love, but about reappropriation and burial of Judaism. She disapproves the insincerity of Philosemitism, which was actually an undermining of the spirit and nature of Judaism. But even just as a thought experiment, one wonders why Philosemitism is always considered insincere, while anti-Semitism is always considered sincere. Indeed, few researchers question the existence of anti-Semitism, but Philosemitism as a concept is usually treated with suspicion. So if we refer to anti-Semitism as a concept describing a certain phenomena in history, there is no reason, I think, to treat Philosemitism, not to treat Philosemitism the same way and to doubt its ontological status. The question is especially relevant to the current age in which Philosemitism, I think, emerges as a political, cultural, and theological phenomenon which cannot be overlooked. And that's why I think we have to, in a way, to align our view of the relations between Philosemitism and anti-Semitism. So I will now elaborate on these questions through the case of German Philosemitism, or conception of the role of the Hebrew people in the 18th century. As demonstrated by Albert Breuer, the German Enlightenment was maybe surprisingly more philosemitic than parallel movements in the rest of Europe. The reason is that the dominant stream of German Enlightenment lacked the anti-clerical impulse of deism, which found Judaism an easy target. In the mid-18th century, a proliferation of deist attacks on the Bible and on the idea of the chosen people appeared in different European countries. Voltaire's attack, published in 1765, was perhaps the most provocative. He claimed that Abraham was in fact an ancient Indian wise whose name was connected to Brahma or the Brahmins, and that the Indian wisdom has been stolen by the Jews. German Bible scholars were overall hesitant to join these attacks. They were busy striving for a historicizing of biblical tradition and its rational incorporation into contemporary anthropological models of their time and scheme of natural development of humanity. Although they used similar methods and were influenced by the skeptical essays that attacked the Old Testament's authenticity, these scholars pursued an opposite goal. Rather than undermine biblical description, they sought to establish the biblical narrative as historical past. In many cases, they were attempting to guard traditional historical conceptions from the new skeptical stances that denied the credibility and authenticity of biblical description. So I think this is the context in which a modern German biblical interpretation emerges, and we have to remember that. Gotthold Ephraim Lessing elaborated this developmental scheme of the Hebrew people's history in his Education of the Human Race from 1777, which was to become the canonical manifesto of German Protestant rationalism. Lessing reinterpreted the idea of revelation, describing it as gradual development of the human mind from savagery to rationality and refinement. He thus formulated a new philosophical version of salvation history in which the Israelites play a major role. God chose these people as educators of humankind. He defends the role of the Israelite people in the process of revelation. Of course, Lessing is a supersessionist. For him, the next step would be the Christian revelation, which in turn would be replaced by a new religion to bring the process of education to its ultimate completion. The Jewish people represented for him the childhood of humanity. But while supersessionist, Lessing essays also illustrates the supreme importance accorded to ancient Israel in his view of historical development. It points to the ancient Hebrews as key players in the universal process of educating humanity. This view is not trivial if we take into consideration the attitude of other Enlightenment philosophers towards the Hebrew legacy. I also already mentioned Voltaire's attacks against the Bible, but no less striking is Immanuel Kant, who totally excludes Judaism from his narrative of religious progression. Kant does not merely contrast Judaism to his ideal of true universal religion. He also argues that Judaism has no essential connection to the development of the Christian faith and accordingly to universal ethics. Kant's philosophy of history left the Jews out of the history of human progress. In the 19th century, many non-Jewish historians and scholars excluded the history of the Israelites from the general secular history of humanity. The emergence of the Indo-European hypothesis, which incorporated ancient India into the history of Western civilization, contributed to diverting the Jews from the main course of universal history. The supposed discovery of an ancient Brahmin tradition, older than the biblical one, induced scholars to revise the history of culture's origin. As concepts of race gained prominence, the distinction between the history of the Jews and the history of humanity became even more accentuated. This shift posed a new challenge for Jewish intellectuals. While struggling to retain their place within the universal Christian view of history, Jewish philosophers, intellectuals, and Bible interpreters now also had to defend this entire Judeo-centric tradition against new theories such as the Indo-Aryan hypothesis that were much more hostile and exclusive in relation to the biblical legacy. Furthermore, despite its Christian character, Hebraist discourse was relatively accessible to Jews, facilitating various kinds of relations, albeit limited between Christian and Jewish writers. This background explains why Lessing's evaluation of the Jews' contribution to the process of Weltaufklärung, of Enlightenment, and other similar works meant so much to Jewish thinkers around 1800. Unlike Kant, Lessing's narrative acknowledges the Jews' role in the salvation of humanity. And even though it locates the Jews at a primitive phase in the process of revelation, it nevertheless integrates them into a continuum with Christianity and the imminent universal religion. So, to conclude, I tried to make a few points, and I'll put it very simply. One, that we should consider the possibility that Philosemitism might really exist. Two, that some bias concerning the Jews is probably inevitable. Israel, as a concept, plays such a central and pivotal role in modern terminology of hermeneutics that an exceptional relation to it cannot be neutralized and or normalized. And three, that in some cases, supersessionism is not the worst option. Thank you very much.